Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I'm the sort of guy that you can come to with any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, or The Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion, or any of his other stories, translations, his life, all that stuff. I'm the guy that can answer your question. And if I can't answer your question immediately, I do a bunch of research, and then I come back and I answer your question. And if you want to ask me a question, you can feel free to do so in the comment section right here or in any of my videos. This is an avenue that many people have used successfully. However, if you're looking to be featured in a video, I source all of the questions and answers that I do here from Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing website where you can go and ask any sort of question and have people either with the relevant experience or relevant knowledge or relevant credentials in some way or another answer you. And if you go there and you ask any sort of question about Tolkien, after you ask the question, you're going to be given a list of people that you can tag to answer you. And my name will be at or near the top of that list. So if you tag me, I'll get your answer that way. Or way easier, just go into the description of this video, and right there's a link to my Quora account right there, where you can just look me up by name. It's the same name as the channel, John Sierra. I don't have Tolkien Scholar as part of the name there, but you'll find me very quickly. There's also a link to the Grey Havens, which is my Quora space, which has not only my writing, but other people's writing as well. Anyway, we have 11 questions to get to, and I'm going to ask you all the normal things that a YouTuber asks the audience to do, which is to like the video, to comment on the video, to subscribe if you haven't already, and all that. And I'll go through that spiel at the end, too, because maybe you're a little on the fence here. But anyways, we have 11 questions to get to, and before we get to any questions, I wanted to do a little bit of reading from you. And today we're going to be reading from The Return of the King, being the third part of The Lord of the Rings. And the section that I've chosen, and I might have done a reading of this at one point in the past, but it's relevant, is the first bit of the Battle of Pelennor Fields, especially concerning not only the death of Theoden, King of Rohan, but most especially the death of the Witch King, because one of the questions is about that. And the exact wording used here is important to understand what actually happens to the Witch King when not only when Éowyn strikes him, because obviously he just dies, but before that, when Merry strikes him from behind, is very, very important. I've talked about this on multiple occasions, but there is a question later on that deals with this, and this section is quite wonderful as well. So here we go. I'm going to start from here. Theoden, king of the Mark, had reached the road from the gate to the river, and he turned toward the city that was now less than a mile distant. He slackened his speed a little, seeking new foes, and his knights came about him, and Durnhelm was with them. Ahead nearer the walls, Elfhelm's men were among the siege engines, hewing, slaying, driving their foes into the fire pits. Well nigh all the northern half of the Pelennor was overrun. And their camps were blazing, orcs were flying toward the river like herds before the hunters, and the Rohirrim went hither and thither to their will. But they had not yet overthrown the siege nor won the gate. Many foes stood before it, and on the further half of the plain were other hosts still unfought. Southward, beyond the road, lay the main force of the Haradrim, and there their horsemen were gathered about the standard of their chieftain. And he looked out, and in the growing light he saw the banner of the king, and that it was far ahead of the battle, with few men about it. Then he was filled with a red wrath, and shouted aloud, and displaying his standard, black serpent upon scarlet, he came against the white horse and the grain, with great press of men. And the drawing of the scimitars of the Southrons was like a glitter of stars. Then Theoden was aware of him, and would not wait for his onset, but crying to Snowmane, he charged headlong to greet him. Great was the clash of their meeting. But the white fury of the Northmen burned the hotter, and more skilled was their knighthood with long spears and bitter. Fewer were they, but they clove through the Southrons like a firebolt in a forest. Right through the press drove Theoden Thengil's son, and his spear was shivered as he threw down their chieftain. Out swept his sword, and he spurred to the standard, hewed staff and banner, and the black serpent foundered. Then all was left unslain of their cavalry turned and fled far away. But lo, Suddenly, in the midst of the glory of the king, his golden shield was dimmed. The new morning was blotted from the sky. Dark fell about him. Horses reared and screamed. Men cast from the saddle lay grovelling on the ground. To me, cried Theoden. Up Eorlinga's fear no darkness, but Snowmane, wild with terror, stood up on high, fighting with the air, and then with a great scream he crashed upon his side. A black dart had pierced him. The king fell beneath him. The great shadow descended like a falling cloud, and behold, it was a winged creature, if bird, then greater than all other birds, and it was naked, and neither quill nor feather did it bear, and its vast pinions were as webs of hide between horn fingers, and it stank. A creature of an older world, maybe it was, whose kind, lingering in forgotten mountains cold beneath the moon, outstayed their day, and in hideous eyrie bred this last untimely brood apt to evil. And the Dark Lord took it and nursed it with fell meats until it grew beyond the measure of all other things that fly. And he gave it to his servant, to be his steed. Down it came, and then, folding its fingered webs, it gave a croaking cry, and settled upon the body of Snowmane, digging in its claws, stooping its long, naked neck. Upon it sat a shape, black-mantled, huge and threatening. A crown of steel he bore, but between rim and robe naught was there to see, save only a deadly gleam of eyes. The Lord of the Nazgul. To the air, save only a deadly gleam of To the air he had returned, summoning his steed ere the darkness failed, and now he was come again, bringing ruin, turning hope to despair and victory to death. A great black mace he wielded. But Theoden was not utterly forsaken. The knights of his house lay slain about him, or else mastered by the madness of their steeds were borne far away. Yet one stood there still, Dernhelm the young, faithful beyond fear, and he wept, for he had loved his lord as a father. Right through the charge Merry had been borne unharmed behind him until the shadow came, and then Windfolla had thrown them in his terror, and now ran wild upon the plain. Merry crawled on all fours like a dazed beast, and such a horror was on him that he was blind and sick. King's man, his heart cried within him, you must stay by him. As a father you shall be to me, you said. But his will made no answer, and his body shook. He dared not open his eyes or look up. Then, out of the blackness in his mind, he thought he heard Dernhelm speaking. Yet now the voice seemed strange, recalling some other voice that he had known. Begone, foul Dwemerlake, lord of Carrion, leave the dead in peace. A cold voice answered, Come not between the Nazgul and his prey, or he will not slay thee in thy turn. He will bear thee away to the houses of lamentation beyond all darkness, where thy flesh will be devoured and thy shriveled mind be left naked to the lidless eye. A sword rang as it was drawn. Do what you will, but I will hinder it if I may. Hinder me? Thou fool! No living man may hinder me. Then Merry heard of all the sounds in that hour the strangest. It seemed that Dernhelm laughed, and the clear voice was like the ring of steel. But no living man am I. You look upon a woman. Eowyn am I, Eomund's daughter. You stand between me and my lord and kin. Begone, if you be not deathless, for living or dark and dead I will smite you if you touch him. The winged creature screamed at her, but the ring-wraith made no answer and was silent, as if in sudden doubt. Very amazement for a moment conquered Merry's fear. He opened his eyes, and the blackness was lifted from them. There some places from him sat the great beast, and all seemed dark about it, and above it loomed the Nazgul lord like a shadow of despair. A little to the left facing them stood she whom he had called Dernhelm, but the helm of her secrecy had fallen from her, and her bright hair, released from its bonds, gleamed with pale gold upon her shoulders. Her eyes, grey as the sea, were hard and fell, yet tears were on her cheek. A sword was in her hand, and she raised her shield against the horror of her enemy's eyes. Eowyn it was, and Dernhelm also, for into Merry's mind flashed the memory of the face that he saw at the riding from Dunharrow. The face of one that goes seeking death, leaving no hope. Pity filled his heart, and great wonder, and suddenly the slow-kindled courage of his race awoke. He clenched his hand. She should not die, so fair, so desperate. At least she should not die alone, unaided. The face of their enemy was not turned toward him. But still he hardly dared to move, dreading lest the deadly eyes should fall on him. Slowly he began to crawl aside. But the black captain, in doubt and malice intent upon the woman before him, heeded him no more than a worm in the mud. Suddenly the great beast beat its hideous wings, and the wind of them was foul. Again it leaped into the air, and then swiftly fell down upon Éowyn, shrieking, striking with beak and claw. Still, she did not blench, maiden of the Rohirrim, child of kings, slender but as a steel blade, fair yet terrible. A swift stroke she dealt, skilled and deadly. The outstretched neck she clove asunder, and the hewn head fell like a stone. Backward she sprang as the huge shape crashed to ruin. Vast wings outspread crumpled on the earth, and with its fall the shadow passed away. A light fell about her, and her hair shone in the sunrise. Out of the wreck rose the Black Rider, tall and threatening, towering above her. With a cry of hatred that stung the very ears like venom, he let fall his mace. Her shield was shivered in many pieces, and her arm was broken. She stumbled to her knees. He bent over her like a cloud, and his eyes glittered. He raised his mace to kill. But suddenly he too stumbled forward, with a cry of bitter pain, and his stroke went wide, driving into the ground. Merry's sword had stabbed him from behind, shearing through the black mantle and passing up beneath the hauberk that pierced his sinew behind his mighty knee. "Éowyn, Éowyn!" cried Merry, then tottering, struggling up with her last strength, she drove her sword between crown and mantle as the great shoulders bowed before her. The sword broke, sparking into many shards. The crown rolled away with a clang. Éowyn fell forward upon her fallen foe, but lo, the mantle and hauberk were empty. Shapeless, they lay now on the ground, torn and tumbled, and a cry went up into the shuddering air, and faded to a shrill wailing, passing with the wind, a voice bodiless and thin that died, and was swallowed up, and was never heard again in that age of the world. So I'm actually gonna talk about this passage more a bit later in the video, and sort of what some of this signifies, and I think it's one of, if not the most misunderstood passage in The Return of the King, if not in all of the Lord of the Rings, because I feel like a lot of people, they get very caught up in the whole angle of prophecy. And we talked about this last week of how the Witch King would know that, that he was, invulnerable to men, which was not the case. It's not that he only could be killed by someone who is not a man, whatever that means, as it could mean several things. But that the prophecy that Glorfindel made was that he would be killed, not by the hand of man. It doesn't mean it was impossible to do otherwise. And I think, the movie muddles the waters here a little bit, because in the movie he says, "No man can kill me," whereas this he says, "No living man shall hinder me," because he feels that he's invincible, not because of a prophecy he heard, but because of the fact that he is so empowered, that he was given what Tolkien referred to as additional demonic force from the Dark Lord Sauron. And what's interesting here is that when she does declare herself to be a woman, he sort of pauses for a moment as if he's like, "Oh, wait a minute," like a little bit of doubt enters his mind. But it's not really because she's a woman. It's because he's up against somebody who's standing up to him and who is saying, "You know what, it doesn't matter. I will hinder you. I will smite you if you are not deathless." And and it's sort of a far cry from how he had talked to Gandalf earlier, and sort of the bravado that he has is starting to fade a little bit here, and this speech is very important because it lets Merry get in place and stab him, and it undoes the. Oh, I have to get the exact wording here. Actually, was that? Hold on, let me bring that up. Battle of Pelennor Fields. Here we are. It doesn't actually say it there. I should have gone a little further. I think, but we've already stopped here. I will bring up the exact part that I'm looking for, because it's very important to know Merry's part in this, because this isn't just about, Éowyn killing the Witch King because she's a woman, and this being sort of a response to Shakespeare in Macbeth, sort of copping out of what Tolkien thought was an easy solution, or at least an interesting solution, and going for a very convoluted solution and a less interesting solution to the prophecy of somebody being no man born of woman. And when Tolkien was a young man and he was reading Shakespeare, he thought, well, that must mean a woman then, because a woman is not a man born of woman. I'm sorry, I was searching as I was talking, which sort of scrambled my brains a little bit. But anyway, it's not just about that. It's about Merry doing this as well. And here is the part that I was looking for, which is a little bit later in the chapter, which talked about Merry's sword. Now, when a little bit earlier we had heard the idea from Aragorn that any blade that touches the Witch King shall perish. And we saw this happen instantly with Éowyn's blade as she stabbed him in the face. We get this fantastic description of her sword sort of exploding into splinters with sparks flying everywhere. And then a bit later in the chapter, and this is important as well, Merry's sword also falls apart. And here is that part here, right after that. So passed the sword of the Barrow Downs, work of Westernesse. But glad would he have been to know its fate, who wrought it slowly, long ago in the North Kingdom, when the Dunedain were young, and chief among their foes was the dread realm of Angmar, and its sorcerer king. No other blade, not through mightiest hands that wielded it, would have dealt that foe a wound so bitter, cleaving the undead flesh, breaking the spell that knit his unseen sinews to his will. And that's the really important part, because Éowyn, if she had just stabbed the Witch King by herself, the sword would have still exploded, and then he would have killed her. He would have been fine. He had to be stabbed by this particular weapon, which was made specifically to fight the Nazgul, and it's mentioned that somebody in the past who's long since dead would have been very happy to know that this sword that he made did this, that it made the Witch King vulnerable enough for Éowyn to kill him. Now, some people choose to interpret that as soon as Merry struck him, he was basically dead, he was doomed. That's not really the case. He had become vulnerable, and we don't know if that would have been a permanent state or whether it would have worn off after a bit, but we know that it made him vulnerable. It basically had to be a 1-2 combo. But we're going to talk a little bit later about the Witch King and his fate, and sort of some of the other ideas that Tolkien had about the Witch King's fate before he settled on, that he had died right there. There were some other ideas that Tolkien had about the Witch King actually still returning after this, which wouldn't have worked with the mythology, which is probably why he didn't do that. But anyway, we have, as I mentioned, 11 questions to get to, so let's start with your first question. Our first question here comes in from the request of Kamali Kokavali, who asks, are there any distinct places in Middle-earth who were not affected or didn't know about the War of the Ring in the Third Age? No, actually. The War of the Ring was essentially, for all intents and purposes, it was a world war. Not to say that it was analogous to the world wars that that we had, or that it was meant to be an allegory for that, because Tolkien denies that pretty categorically. And even in the intro to The Lord of the Rings, he talks about if he was writing an allegory for the world wars, he would have written it differently, and even talks about what would have been different. For example, the ring would have absolutely been seized by the forces of good and used as a weapon against Sauron. But in this instance, so I'm telling you that he's writing a story of a world war, but not a story based upon, our world wars. The very story of the War of the Ring, it's told through the lens of The Lord of the Rings, and it's to show you that even a peaceful, idyllic place like the Shire, which has very little contact with other lands and it isn't concerned with global politics, was drawn into the war. The point is especially driven home in the war's aftermath, as in Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin could not simply just return home and resume their lives. The war had come home with them. Another example of this is seen in The Return of the King. We see the Druidan, led by a person named Ganburi Gan. And the Druidan are, I should say the Druidine, that's the plural form. They are an indigenous tribe, and they're drawn into the war themselves, which is important for them because they wind up with better relations with Rohan. On the typical map of the northwest of Middle-earth, of which we see the perfect example contained in the book itself, the lands that seem the least involved would be Lindon and Mirkwood and the mysterious Khand. However, we don't know if Khand had any sort of government, or what part they, if they did have a government, what part they officially took part in the war. But there were mercenaries from Khand that fought in Sauron's forces, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Mirkwood had a representative in the war in the south in the form of their prince Legolas, and Lindon's envoy Galdor was present during the Council of Elrond. So what about the parts that are not on the map? The vast swaths of Rhûn and the hinterlands beyond, where Bilbo claimed that there were wild wereworms, or the far south beyond Umbar and near Harad. These comprised a large part of Sauron's human forces. The men that joined him were mercenaries and slaves, and sometimes even willing allies from these lands that were to the east and to the south. While there were likely, in a world war, this is more of a Cold War term, but fourth world countries, hinterlands that are, not developed enough to have a stake in the war, they were probably still affected by it or aware of it. And we aren't told any specific lands as such, or that the war didn't affect them, because it almost certainly did. It was affecting everything everywhere. We're only given a very small portion of the map, and we're only told what would happen there. And even then, so much of it is focused on Gondor, and there were great battles happening up in Dale and Erebor and even Lothlorien. So, there was a lot going on. It's definitely a world war. I would not say, if there is a place, that some tucked away little hamlet somewhere that wasn't aware of what was going on and it wasn't affected by the war. We aren't told that, and it isn't named. So, and that's the problem, is that the stuff that's off the map doesn't really have names. So, there's that too. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Matthew Humphrey, who asks, can you explain how an elf's reincarnation works? Do they remember who they were? Could they end up being their own descendants? So elf reincarnation doesn't work in that specific way. They're not reborn, but it's actually more of a literal interpretation of the word reincarnation, and they do retain their memories. An elf being reincarnated is not being born again, because they didn't actually die. This sort of reincarnation, where a spirit is reborn as a baby, essentially having a brand new life starting from zero. It's not seen in the elves, but it is seen in one particular dwarf, Durin the Deathless. So Durin was called the Deathless due to the fact that while most dwarves lived anywhere from, usually around 250 to 300 years of age, he just kept going. He didn't die. He eventually did die sometime near the end of the First Age, at an age that we can approximate at about 2,500 years. Dwarves believe that Durin reincarnates into his own line. When a baby dwarf that is in the line of Durin is born, the dwarves can somehow just tell that it's him, reborn, and they give him the name Durin, which just means king, by the way. And this tradition continues until Durin the Second, the seventh, the last, is born, sometime in the Fourth Age. And he's the final incarnation of Durin, who successfully retakes Moria and reestablishes the kingdom of Khazad-dûm. According to the works of Thorin the Second Oakenshield, on his deathbed, dwarves believe that they go to Mandos when they perish, which suggests that all dwarves are, in fact, deathless. If Thorin was correct, and there's really no reason to believe that he's not, dwarves don't pass from the world like men do, but they linger in Mandos until the end of the world. It's believed that they will be given an afterlife at that point, and they will join the mortal races. This is likely due to the fact that dwarves are not children of God, who is called a Luvatar. He gave them life, but they were constructs created by the angel Aulë, and thus they were not part of the original plan of creation. Durin returning in this way may be either the angels or even God himself resetting his soul and putting it into a newborn dwarf, or it is possible that he doesn't actually reincarnate. It's just that every once in a while a child is born that is so like Durin that the dwarves believe that he is and treat him as if he were, and he doesn't retain his old memories or anything like that. That being said, elves are sort of similar in a way, as if they are slain or perish in some other unnatural way because they don't die naturally, they go to Mandos. But for them, this is a temporary measure. While God did not have a plan for the dwarves and was just sort of welcoming them to the party, the elves were part of his original plan. And this plan involved the elves not dying. If an elf perishes, their spirit goes to Mandos, which is a real physical place in the world. It's not like a limbo or anything like that. And they're not meant to stay there unless the keeper of Mandos is an angel named Namo, unless he intervenes. No one can exit Mandos without Namo's permission. Not even the other angels, or those with greater authority, such as Manwe. It is his sole domain, and as such the elves even call him Mandos. The elf is reincarnated in the most literal sense. An incarnate means bound to flesh. The elf's spirit is bound to a body. That body is them as much as the spirit is them. The body might become so damaged that it can no longer house the spirit, and this is the sort of body death that elves can succumb to, but their spirits can never pass from the world without divine intervention from God, as seen with Luthien. So to reincarnate is to be bound to flesh again. This does not involve a rebirth. They just get a new body, and it's said to be exactly identical to the old one. And we're not really told if things like scars or missing limbs come back if this happens. It didn't happen for Beren, but Beren's not an elf. That was sort of a unique exception. He still had a missing hand. And this can't happen until their former body is fully withered away in the world, which happens very quickly in Middle-earth. It doesn't happen, though, in Aemon, the Undying Lands, which is where Mandos is, by the way, as in the case of Miriel. Miriel's body was kept for when she wished to return to life. It is also said that Manwe can instantly wither a body to nothing. We see examples of this in the Silmarillion. It happens to Feanor. I know people say, well, that was his fiery spirit burning up his body. That it wasn't. His spirit wasn't literally made of fire. It was a name given to him because he was such a temperamental guy. That's how the elves name people. Feanor, meaning spirit of flame, is not literal. So we just want to, let's just put that aside there. And in the Lord of the Rings, it happens with Saruman. And in both of these cases, it isn't done, for reincarnation purposes, but seemingly to prevent the spirits from trying to re-inhabit these bodies. It forces Feanor to go to Mandos and Saruman to wander Middle-earth as basically a ghost. The elvish memories are stored in the soul, so they don't forget anything. And they are the same person, and they are treated as if they are the same person because, as I said, they are. They just get a new body. It's like sort of like if you were dying and then they said we could clone your body and then transfer your brain over to your new body and you'll still be alive and everything. And which is a topic that comes up in some science fiction media. Sort of like that sort of idea, just more fantastical and mythological than science fiction. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Glorfindel Jones. Very funny. Would the owners of the IP for the Peter Jackson The Lord of the Rings have a case against Amazon for its depiction of the Balrog in The Rings of Power? The Jackson Balrog isn't very texturally based, yet Amazon's is almost identical. Horns, for instance. And I find this to be a very interesting question. And just to keep in mind, I'm not like a lawyer, a legal expert or anything, but I can definitely answer this. Neither depiction of Durin's Bane really matches the description of the Balrog in the books. And doesn't match any description seen in the Silmarillion of what Balrogs actually look like. But they're both sort of doing their own thing, but they are very similar. Now, first, let's take a look at the movie version. We're going to put it here. So it's not really man-shaped, which is what Tolkien said Balrogs look like. And though in the shot it's hard to see, the Balrog had wings, whereas in the book wings was just a metaphor for the shadow aura spreading across the cavern. Now let's look at Durin's Bane as seen in the Rings of Power. I'll put that one over here. And they're similar at a very brief glance. And I could go on and give you all these ways that they're different. For example, the horns curving in a very different fashion, but that's sort of beside the point. The point is asking if New Line Cinema and Peter Jackson would have some sort of case against Amazon for doing something that's very similar. It's a bit of a shame that Durin's Bane looked like this in the show because the designer, who's a guy named Nick Keller, had an absolutely amazing first sketch of Durin's Bane that I would have preferred, and I'm going to put that on the screen now. So this much more humanoid Balrog with a shadow that could seem like wings is much more in line with Tolkien, and the horns could be part of a helmet. We're not told that the Balrog Durin's Bane wears a helmet, but in the Silmarillion we are told that the Balrog that Glorfindel killed was wearing one. So I would happily accept horns if they were part of an ornate helmet. Now, there are two reasons why, Peter Jackson and all that would not have a case against Amazon for copying the design from the films. The first is that this version of a Balrog is not really all that original. So I'm going to put another picture up here. And this is an illustration of Gandalf and the Balrog facing off on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, drawn by an artist named John Howe. There were a lot of interpretations of Balrogs that were, around before the films. And Peter Jackson chose specifically to do something based on John Howe's art. It's not a direct copy of John Howe's art, but it's inspired by it, and you can plainly see, several differences. But that's sort of where the idea of this type of Balrog came from. It didn't come from Peter Jackson. Now, the other reason, and the biggest one, is I'm going to put the picture of Nick Keller's concept art up again. And you see that logo in the lower left-hand corner? Weta FX. The same company that worked on the films. Amazon just used the same company that Jackson did. So it's not really a surprise that you wind up with something very similar, even if the designer tried to do something more unique and something more like what Tolkien wrote. He sort of overruled him and wanted something more like the movie. And that's fine. You don't see the Balrog in the Rings of Power for very long. There's two Balrogs. One is in a flashback, and the other, is the one below Moria that you see at the very end of the first season, and then you see it very briefly in season 2. And I'm sure we'll see it again in the future, of course. But, like I said, that's why they're kind of the same thing, even though they're not really exactly the same company. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in anonymously, and here it is. How did Sauron discover who stole his ring in The Lord of the Rings? Wasn't the ring's power and invisibility supposed to make it undetectable? No, the ring doesn't really make you invisible, and it certainly doesn't make you undetectable. What the One Ring is doing to a person really is an invisibility. This was apparent even as early as The Hobbit, when it was mentioned that even with the ring on, Bilbo could be seen, sort of very faintly if he was in very bright light, such as direct sunlight. In The Lord of the Rings, we're shown, very early on that the One Ring might make Frodo vanish to most, but that Tom Bombadil could see him clearly, and then later, to much worse effect, the Nazgul are also able to see Frodo more clearly when he, puts the ring on, leading to him being stabbed by the Witch King and nearly dying. Note that when spiritual creatures like Sauron or Tom Bombadil wear the ring, they're not affected visibly, they don't vanish, but Isildur, Gollum, Bilbo, Frodo, and even Sam are described as disappearing, though the light of Isildur's Elendilmere was still visible even when he had the ring on, so he had to hide that. What the ring is doing is shunting the person and all of their effects, like their clothes, into a spiritual plane that Tolkien called the Wraith World. Most people cannot see the Wraith World, or at least it's incredibly difficult to perceive, hence being nearly invisible. This is not the same spiritual plane that elves are said to partly live in. I need to mention that because there's some confusion about that sometimes. The Wraith World is described as being just like the regular world. It's just darker and everything's sort of very blurry. Inhabitants of the Wraith World as such are, wraiths. They also see living things as being dark and blurry, hence the Nazgul, using their magic to try to compel Frodo to wear the ring. They know that they're after a hobbit and that they must bring this hobbit and to their master, preferably alive and unharmed. But there's 4 hobbits. So how do they know which one? Now, you would think they just grab all of them, but, once Frodo puts on the ring, he's drawn into that same world as them, and he sees the wraiths clearly where before they had been invisible to him, and they see him clearly as the other figures are dark and blurry. So donning the ring actually makes it easier for the agents of Sauron to find Frodo, not harder. The closest thing that Frodo gets to being detected by Sauron himself is when he wears the ring while sitting on the Seat of Seeing, which is almost like contacting Sauron via the Palantir and then giving him the finger while wearing the One Ring on that finger. Thankfully, Frodo gets the ring off in time, and he doesn't even know it, but Gandalf the White is running interference for him. This is also the reason that Sam states that while both he and Frodo had worn the ring, and Sam as recent as Cirith Ungol at the border of Mordor, once they're actually in Mordor proper, it would be disastrous to actually wear the ring. When Frodo not only puts on the ring at Samath Naur, but claims it as his own, Sauron sees him directly, and if not for the intervention of Gollum, all would have been lost. Now, of course, now that we've established how the ring works and all that, it's time to actually tackle the question here. How did he find out? How did Sauron find out who had the ring? As far as Sauron knew, the last person that had it was Isildur, and according to Gandalf, it's very likely that Sauron assumed it had been destroyed by his enemies. Sauron didn't really understand what would happen to the ring, what would happen to him, I should say, if the ring was destroyed. However, this all changed once he met Gollum. At the same time that Bilbo and Thorin were having their adventures against Smaug, Gandalf the Grey joined a party led by Saruman the White to drive Sauron out of the southern portion of Mirkwood. Gandalf had discovered that the necromancer in the forest was Sauron, and thus Saruman led a force to drive the necromancer out. Sauron had been outed, so upon retreating to Mordor, he declared himself openly and started gathering his forces. Sauron used his magic to put out a call to orcs and trolls and all manner of evil creatures to join him in Mordor, and Gollum, who was quite wicked himself, got caught up in this. Gollum had left the mountain, and he was, busy tracking Bilbo, and he was actually getting very close to the Shire when this magic took him, and he found himself traveling to the south. He was captured near the border of Mordor and brought before Sauron, who interrogated the creature. This is how Sauron came to know that his ring had been discovered, as Gollum, he couldn't shut up about it. And this is also how he learned of the existence of the Shire and a hobbit named Baggins. He also learned that when held by others, something that he had never accounted for, the ring was so seductive that no person would actually be able to destroy it, which gave him hope that he could recover it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Dominic Clark, who asks, couldn't they have carried the ring inside of an envelope to avoid touching it and being exposed to its harmful effects? So this is one of those things that's sort of like, aha, I'm onto something. And then when you stop and you really think about it, no, not so much. Because, it seems smart at first. Oh, we'll just keep the ring in an envelope. But you don't touch it, and therefore you're good. You're good to go, right? But here's the thing. The first thing is, there's two things really. The first is that it's not really that easy to do that. Once the ring has become something that's precious to you, you're in a sort of different frame of mind. Gandalf once said the hardest thing that he ever had to do in Middle-earth was to convince Bilbo to give up the ring, to just put it in an envelope and leave it for Frodo. And just think, this is, when he says this is in the story of the quest for Erebor, which takes place, sometime during the Return of the King. He's already fought a Balrog and died. And he's saying the hardest thing I ever had to do was convince Bilbo to give up the ring. That's how precious it was to Bilbo. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf tosses the ring into Frodo's hearth, and this identifies it as the One Ring, because then we get the glowing letters and all that. But after this demonstration, this shows also that fire is not going to harm the ring. Gandalf pulls the ring out of the fire with some tongs, and he holds it out to Frodo, and he says, don't worry, it's quite cool, it's not going to burn you. And he puts the ring that was just in the fire into Frodo's bare hand, and it's not even warm, warmer than it was before, much less, damaged or melted in any way. And then Frodo, he says something very interesting. He says he wants to see the ring destroyed. And, Tolkien in one of his letters sort of said this is where Frodo failed right here. And it's because it's not really true. And Gandalf puts him to the test, and he says, go and toss it in the fire right now. And Frodo knows that's not going to work. And he could have looked at him and he said, but that's not going to work, Gandalf, now is it? You put it in the fire, and it wasn't even, a little bit warmer. But instead, he just sort of struggles, and he just looks at the ring, and he finds it to be very beautiful, and he doesn't want to harm it, and he just can't bring himself to put the ring into the fire, even though he knows it's not going to hurt the ring. And we see a similar thing with Isildur, because Isildur wrote that when he first got the ring, you could see the lettering on it, and the lettering eventually faded. And he had theorized that the writing on the ring could only be seen when it was exposed to heat, and that it was the heat of Sauron's hands that made it glow like that, and that perhaps if exposed to fire, you would see these letters again. But he doesn't want to do this because it's become precious to him, and he can't bear the thought of possibly harming it. So you see it happened to Isildur, it happened to Bilbo, it happened to Frodo, So if Frodo was to just put the ring in an envelope, he would be constantly like, is it still in there? I have to check on it. So he would be constantly pulling it out of there to check on it. I mean, Even in book 1, we see he's told, don't use the ring. And what does he do? He always has his hand in his pocket, just sort of playing with it. He puts it on a few times. It leads to disaster. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you don't actually need to touch the ring or even to possess the ring to be affected by it. Just ask Boromir. Or even better, ask Saruman. Saruman never even saw the ring. He was never even in the same general vicinity as the ring. And he still lusted after it so much that he went completely off the deep end and became, sort of evil. Of course, there were other reasons why he did that, but a lot of it was his lust for the ring. Which is funny because, like, in another story in Unfinished Tales, it's mentioned that Aragorn and Gimli go into Orthanc at one point, and they find this, like, sort of secret hidden room where they find the Elendilmere, which was Isildur's crown. And it was the original one, not the copy that Aragorn was wearing, but the original one, which makes them believe that he actually found Isildur's remains and probably disposed of them in some way, such as burning them in the furnaces, and that he kept this thing. But in this, like, sort of little hidden trophy room, there was this one little place of honor where something could be kept, and there was nothing there. And they believe that this is where Saruman thought that he was going to stick the One Ring if he ever obtained it. Of course, once again, he wouldn't be able to do it. He'd be constantly going in there to look at it. It would be precious to him. He'd want to hold it. He'd want to touch it. He'd want to caress it. He'd want to talk to it like Gollum did. So, yeah, putting an envelope wouldn't make much of a difference. As a matter of fact, it would probably more easily be lost because the ring sometimes tries to jump ship and get away. And if it was an envelope, it would probably find some way to slip out of the envelope at one point when nobody was looking. So there's that as well. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Sam Hoyle, and this is a very simple question. It's a bit wordy, but it boils down to a very simple question that has a very complicated answer. So here's the way that Sam wrote it. What happens when elves sleep in the Tolkien universe? When I read the passage about Legolas dreaming or sleeping in some way in the Two Towers, I found it hard to understand what Legolas was experiencing. So, of course, what you're really asking is, do elves sleep? Because Legolas started pacing back and forth while Gimli and Aragorn slept. And it makes you wonder, do elves sleep? Is this a normal thing that elves do? Do they sleep like that? Is that sleeping? Or was he choosing not to sleep? What's happening? So let's talk about it. Elves can sleep and they can dream, but they do it differently from mortals. The debate stems from a depiction in Book 3, which is the first half of The Two Towers, where Legolas and Gimli get into a disagreement about whether their small group should continue pursuing the group of orcs that kidnapped Merry and Pippin through the night, or rest and then begin again in daytime. And Legolas, he's against stopping because he feels that they don't really need the rest and that the orcs have such a big head start and that they're just going to lose so much ground and it's going to be a disaster. Gimli's thought is that because Aragorn found one of the leaves of Lorien dropped by the hobbits as a sign, and in the dark, he might miss additional signs or they might lose the trail. So Aragorn sides with Gimli. He's like, yeah, even though we would possibly catch up with them more, we might actually lose track of them in the dark. So they decide to take a brief rest. So Legolas is described as pacing around with his eyes opened as he sleeps, something unlike the sleep of man or the sleep of dwarves. Legolas is a bit unusual in the narrative, even by elvish standards. He does things that you don't ever hear other elves doing, such as hearing the voices of stones in Book 2, or walking on freshly fallen snow without leaving any imprint or sinking down into the snow, like in Book 2 as well. We do know that elves can sleep in a relatively normal fashion, however. Gallion the butler, as well as another elf that didn't have a name, well, I'm sure he had a name, but it wasn't mentioned in the book, in The Hobbit, they both fell asleep after drinking heavily, and that let Bilbo have the ability to steal the keys and rescue Thorin and the rest of the dwarves. Legolas stands and paces in this sort of weird sleep state, but he's also described as laying down to sleep, though still with his eyes open, and a little bit later when they're in Fangorn Forest, described as him laying motionless. Turgon and Finrod absolutely fall asleep in the Silmarillion, tiring and resting by the river Sirion, and they are sent dreams by Ulmo, not to mention the Maiar Olorin, who's later called Gandalf, was said to have given the elves fair visions, and his name is derived from Olor, or Olos, which means dream. Similarly, Urmo is the Vala that is associated with dreams, and his realm, which is called Lorien, is derived from the same root, Lorien, Olorin. And note that Galadriel and Celeborn are from a realm called Lothlorien, which Treebeard translates as dream flower. Luthien is also mentioned to sleep, and even the Ainur sleep, the angels sleep. Tulkas slumbers after battling Melkor, and Melkor himself was sent into enchanted sleep by Luthien. Though the Hobbit, going back to the whole galley and the butler thing, it might be somewhat unreliable in the fine details, but we can say that Bilbo had to get the keys to the cell somehow, and waiting for the elves to get drunk and fall asleep is perfectly reasonable. I believe that elves do sleep, they just generally don't sleep like people do. They sleep more like fish do. Legolas, in pacing back and forth and staying awake, may have been doing something very similar to what scientists refer to as unihemispheric sleep or slow wave sleep. In this state, basically half the brain rests while the other is alert. This is useful for fish or some birds or prey animals. Elves don't really always sleep like this, and to truly sleep, they need to be a lot more tired than Legolas was, as he was later in Fangorn Forest, as seen in the cases of the drunken wood elves or Fingon and Turgon tiring out. So let's back this up. Elves sleeping and the whole idea of unihemispheric sleep, or at least something similar to it. The original 144 elves were sleeping in the womb of the earth. And they were not born, but rather they awakened and came out of the earth at a place called Cuiviénen. The first 3 elves that awoke came across their eventual mates in the grass, the elf women that would become their wives. And they saw these elf women sleeping, and they just fell in love instantly. And this spurred them to invent language, because they wanted to think of things to say and to sing to their beloveds. They then went and discovered other sleeping elves to awaken. So the best description of how elvish sleeping works is in a book called The Nature of Middle-earth. I'm going to read you a passage here. The occupations of the embodied mind awake are an obstacle to such contacts, lower or higher. They occur, therefore, as the Eldar say, most often in sleep, not in dreams. But in dreaming and sleeping are to the elves other than to men. In sleep the body may, as in men, cease from all activities, save those essential to life, such as breathing, or it may rest from this or that activity or function as the Fea directs. While it is so, the mind may seek repose also and be utterly quiet, but it may be absorbed in its own activity, thinking, that is, reasoning, or remembering, or devising and designing, but these things are at will and of volition. The state that which the elves nearest resemble human dreaming is when the mind is feigning or devising. It is when the mind is quiet and inactive that it most readily receives and perceives contacts from without. So this gives the strongest case for something that would be similar to unihemispheric sleep, though rather than being divided between left brain and right brain, it's divided between body and soul. The body can rest. The body is called the Hroa, while the mind, or the soul, the Fea, is active. The mind can rest while the body is active, like Legolas, or they can both rest. They can sleep to rest their bodies without dreaming, as their mind could be occupied by thoughts, but to receive dreams, they must rest their minds. It is later mentioned that they often have a deep reflection preceding sleep, suggesting that to truly fall into a deep slumber, they have to do a sort of meditation first, meaning that while Legolas can turn off his body or his mind on a whim, to go into a mode of sleep that's similar to men or dwarves, he would have to go into a sort of trance first and prepare himself. I'm going to read you another passage from the Nature of Middle-earth. To speak of elf bodies, an elf body is by nature and function made to be the house of a permanent inhabitant, a Fea that cannot leave time, nor go whence its return to the body is impossible. Such a body, therefore, will wait much longer, maintaining coherence and resisting decay. But then it will usually seem to sleep, lying passive and essaying nothing, not even the search for food without the command of its master. It cannot be fed without waking it, and thus killing it with shock or rendering it beast-like. So this best explains sort of the state of Feanor's mother Miriel. We talked about her a little while ago, who left her body behind and went to Mandos due to extreme fatigue. She was able to go to Mandos and therefore die, as much as an elf actually can, but her body was not dead, it was sleeping. It was noted that her body was tended to so that it would not wither. This seems to be due to the fact that her body would still need to be fed in some way, as some form of magic was likely employed to keep her body from either withering or being destroyed or becoming beast-like until her eventual return to it. Elves do absolutely go into deeper sleep, but not nightly as men do or as dwarves may, and they still seem to be more alert. Finrod, for example, was said to be asleep when the petty dwarf Mim attempted to murder him, though Mim's lack of success can lead us to the thought that Finrod managed to awaken in time, suggesting, that he may have been more alert, and the petty dwarves were driven out of Nargothrond. Another quote where Tolkien mentions elvish sleep is here. As need an Eldarin rider could remain in the saddle for long hours with brief halts and light provision, while his horse maintained a high speed, and they could cover great distances in a day with only a brief few hours rest or sleep before going on again. And note that he says rest or sleep. And this ties into another fact that Legolas embodies in The Lord of the Rings, that elves don't need as much sleep as mortals, and they don't need as much food. Legolas's trance-like state is finally explained by the author in this footnote in The Nature of Middle-earth. Thus an elf may stand asleep with his eyes wakeful and yet hardly breathe, and with his ears closed to all sound. This is a footnote from the earlier quote about an elf's mind resting while the body does not. In this case, it is even mentioned that they cannot hear, though they likely can see as their eyes are wakeful. So elves do sleep and they do dream. They just do it differently from men and from dwarves and from hobbits. And the form of sleep that we go through for a third of our lives, give or take, is undertaken more seldom by elves, only as needed, and they prepare for it through a sort of meditative state. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Jason Moore, who asks, did Merry and Pippin ever reunite with Treebeard? Well, we aren't told that they do, and we aren't told that they don't, but it seems to me very likely that they did. The very last time that Treebeard is mentioned in the main text of The Lord of the Rings is Gandalf stating that he thinks Treebeard is incorrect, that Saruman has reformed, or at the very least that he will not be up to additional mischief, and he warns the hobbits that Saruman is likely up to something terrible in the Shire. In the part of Appendix B that gives a chronology of the events from the fall of Sauron through to the end of the Third Age, Treebeard is mentioned a single time, just noting that the date that he released Saruman from Orthanc. So additional materials don't shed any light on this. Unfinished Tales only mentions Treebeard 3 times, once in the footnotes to the Battles of the Fords of Isen, speaking about a likely meeting between Gandalf and Treebeard, reason due to Gandalf knowing that the Ents' collective's patience with Saruman was at an end. The other 2 times are notes on the linguistics regarding the different names of Lothlorien. So we are never explicitly told that Merry or Pippin met with Treebeard after the Scouring of the Shire, but I would find it highly likely that they did. For one, we do know that Treebeard continued to be active in the Fourth Age, and he was essentially given Isengard by Aragorn II Elisar. We also know that upon hearing that King Eomer of Rohan was ill and near death, both Merry and Pippin traveled to Rohan to be with him before he died. After the passing of Eomer, they traveled to Gondor, where they spent the last years of their lives. After the death of Aragorn, Merry and Pippin's graves were moved to either side of the king. The time spent in Rohan is less than a year. It was the year 1484 of the Shire reckoning when the elderly Merry and Pippin traveled to Rohan, and Eomer passed away that autumn. They then lived in Gondor for a time, and we're not given exact dates of when they passed away, but it was some time before Aragorn, who passed away in 1541 of the Shire Reckoning. Appendix B mentions that Merry was 102 years of age when he left the Shire, which would make Pippin 94, but that Merry was still hale, and that they spent short years in Gondor. So between the few months in Rohan and the traveling to Gondor and the few years that they spent in Gondor and the fact that the author goes out of his way to state that Merry, he might be 102 years old, but he's still hale, it seems unlikely to me that they wouldn't at least pay a visit to their old friend Treebeard at some point during the last years of their life. That isn't to say that there isn't room for them having not met earlier. They were both busy hobbits. Merry was the master of Buckland, and Pippin was the Thane of the Shire. But it's not unreasonable to think that they would sometimes travel to the south to visit their friends, especially we know Aragorn traveled to the north to visit them, though he met them in Bree, not in the Shire. So they might have met Treebeard a bunch of times, for all we know. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Nate Dawkins, and this is a quick one, and I believe I might have covered this one on YouTube before, but it's bound to happen. Questions come up, and then I don't remember if I've done it before. Sometimes I answer a question again because I have a different way of tackling it, or sometimes I just don't remember if I've answered it. But I think I might have answered this one before, but here we go. If Morgoth came back and Sauron had the One Ring, would Morgoth want the ring? And would Sauron give it to him? So I from my perspective, I think that Morgoth would see the ring as this sort of cute little trinket that's very useful for the sort of purposes that he would want Sauron to be up to. But Sauron was its master. He was the creator of it. He was the Lord of the Rings. And I think that he would prefer that Sauron works with the ring, especially since Morgoth preferred everybody else to do all the work for him anyway. Morgoth had his ring. It was Middle-earth. It was the whole of Middle-earth, although he, of course, temporarily focused on the northwestern portion of it in Beleriand. But that's where he put his power. And Sauron did the same thing, but on a different scale. He put it into an actual ring, not a metaphorical one. And I think that Morgoth would appreciate the sort of trickery that Sauron had been up to with the Rings of Power. If anything, Morgoth, if Sauron didn't have the One Ring, Morgoth would recover it and he would hand it to Sauron and say, don't lose it again, and he would probably want to say, hey, let's get some sort of program going where we could start capturing some people and torturing them and force them to wear rings of power until there are slaves and Sauron would be the master of Morgoth's armies again. And if he, and Morgoth, what is he going to do? He's going to sit on his throne and watch it all happen. He likes other people to do his work for him, so he's not going to wear the ring. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Scott Ross, who asks, could Aulë repower the 3 elven rings? No. But perhaps Celebrimbor could, but he actually wouldn't. No one really would. The issue of Aulë, specifically repowering Vilya, Anenya, and Narya, the 3 elven rings, is there's sort of 3 issues here. The first is, regardless of Celebrimbor's intent in making 3 rings to protect against decay and evil and the ravages of time, they were still created using Sauron's magic. Aulë would not wish to replicate such a feat, and after what he'd been through, neither would Celebrimbor. The second issue here is that all 3 rings were brought to the Undying Lands by the bearers, Elrond and Galadriel and Gandalf. The effects that Celebrimbor's Rings of Power create were designed to allow the elves to make Middle-earth more like the Undying Lands, hence the safety of Lindon and Imladris, and most especially the timeless quality that Lothlorien had. As Irenian Gil-galad and the latter Elrond were both born in Middle-earth, as was Círdan, they didn't really know what it was like to be in the Undying Lands. I mean, Gandalf did, but he wasn't trying to be overt, and he's traveling constantly. He didn't, make a realm to be like the Undying Lands. But Lothlorien, that's the place in Middle-earth that was the most like the Undying Lands. And Galadriel, she was born in the Undying Lands, so she knew what she was doing with her ring. However, places like Valinor and Eldamar and Eressëa are already like this all the time. The effect of the rings would be redundant. They're just not needed in the Undying Lands. And finally, the third thing here, it's emotional rather than factual. I'm speaking from emotion here. But I happen to think that if someone brought something made by Sauron's magic to Aulë and asked him to juice it up, it would make him really, really sad. And he's already been through a lot, seeing so many of his students go awry and probably blaming himself where he didn't need to. This would be like waving his regrets in his face, which seems cruel to me. The only person that I could see having rejuvenated, having the ability to rejuvenate these rings would be Celebrimbor, as he was their creator. And this is not like a sword that could be reforged by another person, like Gurthang was or like Andúril was. But he wouldn't have the inclination to repeat mistakes that he had made in the past. Personally, I think that he'd be happy that Galadriel still has her ring and that the other two are in good hands, even if they were just rings at this point. I think I would go so far as to say that he'd be happier knowing that they were just rings at this point. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Rohan Knight, who asks, was Gollum right to challenge Bilbo to reveal what was in his pocket? Oh, now this is a very interesting question, and I personally think that it was fair for Gollum to ask this, though we have to understand that this entire section of The Hobbit was the product of a rewrite of the original text. The original plot of Riddles in the Dark, as written by Tolkien, was different from the version that you're most familiar with. Gollum was actually kind of friendly. He was rather bored, so he challenged Bilbo to a riddle game with a fabulous prize, just to pass the time. Bilbo wins the same way that you know that he won. The ring was already in his pocket. Gollum didn't think to guess that, and Gollum was planning on giving a magic ring as a prize if Bilbo won, but when he went looking for it, it was missing. Bilbo already had it. Gollum was apologetic about not being able to find the prize, but Bilbo said, well, if that's the case, then why don't you lead me to safety? And he doesn't mention the ring. And of course, Gollum happily obliged, and then Bilbo escapes the mountain, and he reunites with the dwarves. In preparing to write The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien was looking at, the ring and its original owner, the necromancer, in a sort of a different way. He had decided that the necromancer, who was mentioned a few times in The Hobbit, was the same character as Sauron, who was a character from the Silmarillion, and that the ring was wholly evil. In doing this, he had to revise The Hobbit to be in continuity with the Silmarillion, and thus Gollum became nastier and obsessed with the ring. And the original story became a lie that Bilbo told to the dwarves and to Gandalf. Since Gollum's character was changed to be much nastier, he had no plans to let Bilbo go. Even if Bilbo won fairly, he was going to grab his ring and turn invisible and strangle Bilbo to death and then eat him. The riddle game is mentioned as being sacred, and that even goblins would not violate the rules, making Gollum sort of a unique evil, worse than the orcs. Of course, we have to take Bilbo's word for it, that even goblins wouldn't bend the rules. However, even as nasty as Gollum is, I would argue that it was fair of him to ask what was in Bilbo's pockets. When Bilbo asked what's in my pocket, he wasn't even speaking to Gollum, he was speaking to himself. He had grabbed the ring and put it in his pocket as he groped around in total darkness. He had forgotten about it because he's in a stressful situation. Gollum misunderstood this question as to be a riddle, which was not fair because it's not a riddle. There's no sort of logic there. It's just guessing. Bilbo could have clarified that he was muttering to himself and this was not a riddle, but Gollum did something unexpected. He chose to accept the question as a riddle under the condition that he be allowed 3 guesses, which Bilbo agrees to, and then even here Gollum attempted to cheat. He made 4 guesses. He guessed knife, he guessed Bilbo's hands, and the last guess he said string or nothing, which Bilbo rightly called out as unfair for sneaking in 2 guesses, but as neither was correct, it didn't matter. I would argue, though, that Gollum was possibly correct when he guessed hands. The text mentions that as Gollum made this guess, Bilbo had only just taken his hands out of his pockets, meaning that his hands were in his pockets when he asked the question, which makes sense, as that's how he felt the ring in there. I could argue that Gollum kind of won there, but of course, Bilbo wasn't going to just be like, okay, yeah, murder me, eat me. In the revised text, that was Gollum's prize for winning, that he would get to eat Bilbo. I would also argue that a sacred riddle, laws or not, I can't see Mr. Baggins just giving himself up to be eaten if he lost. He had a sword. He would try to defend himself or get away somehow. They were both prepared to cheat if things didn't go their way. However, the big reason why I say that it was fair to, having lost, ask Bilbo what's actually in his pockets is that, from Gollum's perspective, he has no reason to really trust Bilbo for his word that he had no knives or no string or hands in his pockets, and that they were not empty. Think of a quiz show, like Jeopardy. If no one gets the answer, they tell you what the answer is. It's important for the narration for Gollum to try and chase Bilbo so that Bilbo discovers how the ring works, and most importantly, to the text and to the sequel for Bilbo to think of using the invisibility to murder Gollum, but then deciding against it. I would come to the conclusion that both parties were prepared to cheat if they lost, but as Bilbo only wanted to get out alive and Gollum wanted to eat him, we of course don't fault Bilbo for being a bit deceptive here. And he's ordinarily very honest, but keep in mind that he starts his deceptions as soon as he gets the ring, and he makes up this sort of cock and bull story about how he got the ring. And, when he finally admits to the dwarves that he has one, at first he sneaks up on them using the ring and then says, oh, I'm just that sneaky. Though even without the ring, I can't see Bilbo just being like, okay, I guess you get to eat me now. I hit me, he has a sword, or he could try to run away. He's not going to. Would you, in that situation, sacred riddle game or not, you're not just going to be like, well, you got me. Go ahead, kill me. It doesn't work like that. There's just no way that would happen. All right, let's move on to the next question. So our final question comes in from a good friend of mine, Laurel Callahan, who asks, if the One Ring was not destroyed, and given enough time, could or would the Witch King have returned to life again after Merry and Pippin struck him down? It's an interesting question, and it's something that Tolkien played around with, and this is why I read that bit earlier where the Witch King is killed by Merry and Pippin, and brought attention to the part about Merry's sword, which came a little after the reading. That was all very important. I said I would come back to that. So I'm going to say no. Tolkien played with the idea, but he changed his mind. He had the idea that the Witch King would come back in the early versions of The Lord of the Rings. And in one of these early versions, he would appear at the Black Gate instead of the mouth of Sauron, and that somehow Sam would just appear behind him and stab him. And then another idea that he had, that the Witch King would actually show up at Sammath Naur. Even after the One Ring was destroyed, he would still be around, and then he would be blocking Frodo and Sam from leaving. And Frodo would tell the Witch King that the ring was thrown into the fire, and the Witch King would dive into the fire to sort of chase down the ring, and he would be fully and wholly destroyed. Tolkien decided against those ideas, and he went with something much simpler. He was dead. He'd been undead for a while, but still tethered to the world. His life extended unnaturally through the necromancy of the Rings of Power. Even though his body was gone, fully withered away, he basically was denied death, denied the gift of man by the Rings of Power. But it was stated in the text that these spells that kept him bound to the world were undone by Merry's strike. And then Éowyn's strike would just send him to the hereafter, whatever that is. And Gandalf sort of had this idea that what was prepared for the likes of the Witch King would sort of be just an endless abyss. He was now just truly dead beyond the circles of the world. He would face his creator and whatever judgment lay beyond. No magic of Sauron or anyone that is, within the circles of the world could call somebody back from beyond the circles of the world. It is possible, that the men who were the Nazgul would return for the final battle, because Turin was supposed to return, and Pharazôn was even said that he might return. But this is the work of God. This is Ilúvatar doing that. He can do that, and it's also a plot thread that it seems that Tolkien just eventually just abandoned as well. So as a mortal, also, mortals' voices are supposed to be added to the second music. But like I said, Gandalf also said that, hey, there's an abyss waiting for you. And the idea of mortals' voices being in the music of the Ainur the second time around, the sequel, would be that the world would be created without evil. So I don't think that evil men like the Witch King would be invited to that sort of thing. They would probably just be destroyed wholly. So there's that as well. Anyway, that's our last question, and I want to thank everybody who has left me comments and everything, and I thank everybody that sent me questions on Quora, and I absolutely love doing this. And I will say at this point, all the things that YouTubers normally say: like the video, hit the like button, hit it, go ahead. Leave me a comment, even if it's just to say hi or to leave some emotes or whatever. I don't care. Just leave me a comment. It helps with engagement and fueling the algorithm and all that stuff. Subscribe if you haven't already. So if you made it all the way to the end of the video and you haven't subscribed, why not? Why'd you watch the whole thing if you didn't like it? But anyway, if you want to support the channel in a greater way than just simply subscribing and liking and commenting and all that stuff, consider membership. Membership on YouTube is a paid subscription. It's like $5 a month is, I believe, what I have it set at. And it's really cheap, and what you get is not only the happy feeling of having supported a YouTuber who works very hard, but also you get to see all the videos early, sometimes a week early, and sometimes even more than a week early, but at least a week early for all the videos, with very, very few exceptions. And you also get some cool emotes that you can use during like live streams, or you could leave them in comments. And you also get a cool badge by your name that evolves over time, at 6 months and a year and such. It changes into different things. It's always going to be the Gandalf G rune, but other things get added to it. As a matter of fact, one of my members was talking to me not too long ago and said, "Hey, I have the little sun icon on my my Gandalf rune now," because it was a year. Anyway, guys, we'll see you next time. It's very late here, and I'm going to bed.